January 12, 1945. The frozen banks of the Vistula River. Soviet Lieutenant General Pavel Rybalko stood before a map that showed what every military expert considered an impregnable fortress, the German defensive line stretching from Warsaw to the Carpathian Mountains. His superior, Marshal Ivan Konev, had just given him an order that seemed to defy all logic, all military doctrine, all common sense. "Take your 3rd Guards Tank Army," Konev said, his voice steady and cold, "and punch through their lines in 48 hours. Not around them. Through them. Directly through the strongest point." The officers in the room fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. The Germans had spent months fortifying this position. Multiple defensive belts. Concrete bunkers. Minefields that stretched for kilometers. Interlocking fields of fire from 88mm anti-tank guns that could destroy a T-34 at 2 kilometers. Artillery zeroed in on every possible approach. And panzer reserves positioned to counterattack any penetration. Military textbooks said you needed a 3-to-1 advantage to attack prepared positions. Rybalko had barely 2-to-1. Military doctrine said you probed for weak points, conducted reconnaissance, prepared artillery barrages for days. Konev was ordering a direct assault in 2 days. "Comrade Marshal," one colonel ventured, "the casualties will be acceptable," Konev interrupted, "compared to the alternative. The Germans expect us to be cautious. They expect us to follow doctrine. They expect us to give them time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to move their reserves. We will give them none of these things. General Rybalko, you will attack with every tank simultaneously. No reserves. No second wave. Everything at once. You will not stop for anything. Disabled tanks will be bypassed, not recovered. Infantry that cannot keep up will be left behind. Your objective is not to defeat the German positions. Your objective is to be in their rear area before they realize you have broken through." What Konev was proposing violated every principle of Soviet military doctrine that had been written in blood over 3 years of brutal warfare. Soviet tactics had evolved into a methodical system, massive artillery preparation, waves of infantry to identify strong points, concentrated armor to exploit breakthroughs, with careful attention to maintaining reserves for exploitation or defense against counterattacks. Konev was throwing all of this away. He was proposing something that looked less like a military operation and more like a cavalry charge from the Napoleonic era, except with 500 tanks instead of horses. The other generals in the room knew what everyone was thinking, but nobody dared say this was madness. This was the kind of reckless attack that had cost the Red Army millions of casualties in 1941 and 1942. This was exactly the type of operation that got commanders shot for wrecking and sabotage. But Konev was no fool, and he was no reckless gambler. He had spent weeks studying intelligence reports, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and captured German documents. He had identified something that nobody else had seen, a fatal flaw in the German defensive psychology. After years of fighting the methodical Soviet offensives, the Wehrmacht had become predictable in their own way. They had learned to weather the initial artillery barrage, hunker down during the first infantry assault, identify the main axis of attack, and then unleash their mobile reserves at exactly the right moment to seal any breakthrough. Their entire defensive system was designed around this sequence. It was brilliant, battle-tested, and nearly unbeatable when executed properly. Konev's insight was devastatingly simple: if you attacked so fast and with such overwhelming force at a single point that the Germans never had time to identify your main effort, never had time to move their reserves, never had time to execute their well-rehearsed defensive plans, their entire system would collapse. Not because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled, they were among the finest troops in the world, but because their command structure would be paralyzed by the speed of events. By the time German commanders realized what was happening and issued orders, Soviet tanks would already be overrunning their headquarters. The morning of January 14, 1945, began with an artillery barrage that was brief by Soviet standards, only 2 hours instead of the usual day-long preparation. German soldiers in their bunkers checked their watches and smiled grimly. 2 hours meant the Soviets weren't serious yet. This was just a probing attack. The real assault would come later, probably in a different sector. They were wrong. At exactly 10 a.m., hundreds of Tu-34 tanks emerged from the morning fog, engines roaring, tracks churning up frozen mud, moving at maximum speed directly toward the strongest point of the German line. No infantry screens. No careful advance. Just pure, concentrated armor moving at 30 km per hour straight into what should have been a killing zone. German anti-tank gunners couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't how the Soviets attacked. This was suicide. They opened fire, and T-34s began to brew up, their turrets flying through the air as ammunition cooked off. But for every tank that died, 3 more kept coming. And they weren't stopping. They weren't maneuvering. They weren't taking cover. They were simply accepting casualties and continuing to advance at full speed. Within the first hour, Rybalko had lost 90 tanks, nearly 20% of his assault force. His staff officers were begging him to halt, to reassess, to bring up the reserves. Rybalko refused. Forward, he ordered. Always forward. Any tank that stops for any reason except mechanical failure will have its commander shot. It was a brutal order, one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But it was also exactly what Konev had demanded. The German defensive system began to crack not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed for a different type of battle. Anti-tank guns that should have stopped the assault were still scoring kills, but Soviet tanks were breaking through before the guns could be relocated. German infantry that should have sealed any penetration found themselves being bypassed by tanks that simply ignored them and raced deeper into German territory. Panzer reserves that should have counterattacked the breakthrough never received the order to move because the communication lines had been cut by Soviet tanks that were already 10 kilometers behind the front line. By nightfall on January 14, Rybalko's tanks had penetrated 40 kilometers into German-held territory, a distance that should have taken weeks, accomplished in a single day. The cost had been staggering: 180 tanks destroyed or disabled, over 1,000 casualties. By conventional military standards, this was a failed attack. By Konev's standards, it was exactly what he had ordered. The German command structure was in chaos. Reports were flooding into headquarters about Soviet tanks appearing in a dozen different locations, all deep in the rear area. Nobody knew where the main attack was because there was no main attack, the entire assault was the main attack. Division commanders were requesting permission to withdraw. Army commanders were trying to organize counterattacks but couldn't determine where to send their reserves. By the time they identified a Soviet concentration, it had already moved. On January 15, Konev committed his second tank army, the 4th Guards under General Lyashenko. Now nearly 1,000 Soviet tanks were rampaging through German rear areas simultaneously. German units that tried to stand and fight found themselves surrounded within hours. Units that tried to withdraw found that Soviet tanks had already cut the roads behind them. The entire German defensive system, which had been designed to be flexible and responsive, became rigid and paralyzed because events were moving faster than the command structure could process them. This was the psychological element that Konev had counted on. German commanders at every level had been trained to make careful, rational decisions based on accurate intelligence. Suddenly they were being asked to make instant decisions based on fragmentary, contradictory reports while Soviet tanks were literally overrunning their headquarters. The human mind, even highly trained military minds, cannot function effectively under those conditions. German officers began making mistakes, not because they were incompetent, but because they were overwhelmed. Some units counterattacked in the wrong direction. Some retreated when they should have held. Some held when they should have retreated. The careful coordination that made the Wehrmacht so effective disintegrated into a series of isolated, desperate actions. By January 17, just 72 hours after the offensive began, Soviet tanks had advanced nearly 100 kilometers, liberating dozens of towns and cities, and most critically, cutting off an entire German army group from its supply lines. The impregnable defensive line that was supposed to hold until spring had been shattered in 3 days. The casualties told the story of Konev's ruthless calculus. Soviet losses were heavy, nearly 400 tanks, over 5,000 casualties. But German losses were catastrophic: 3 divisions completely destroyed, 2 more encircled, over 40,000 casualties, and most importantly, the loss of the psychological advantage they had held for months. German soldiers who had believed their defensive lines could hold indefinitely now knew that nowhere was safe, that Soviet tanks could appear anywhere at any time. The strategic implications were even more profound. The breakthrough at the Vistula opened the road to Berlin. Within weeks, Soviet forces would be fighting in German territory for the first time. The war that Hitler had promised would never reach German soil was now consuming German cities. And it had all started with one suicidal order that conventional military wisdom said could never succeed. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable: Konev's tactic wasn't actually new. It was a return to the oldest form of warfare, the breakthrough assault, the mass charge, the decisive blow. What was revolutionary wasn't the tactic itself, but the willingness to use it at a moment when everyone else believed it was obsolete. The German army had built an entire defensive system based on the assumption that modern warfare had made such attacks impossible. They were right, in a sense. Such attacks were almost impossible. But almost impossible is not the same as impossible, and Konev was willing to pay the price to prove it. The controversy around this operation persists to this day. Military historians argue about whether Konev's tactics were brilliant or merely brutal, whether he was a strategic genius or just a commander willing to accept casualties that Western armies would have found unacceptable. Soviet military academies studied this operation for decades, trying to extract lessons while avoiding the uncomfortable truth that it succeeded partly because Konev was willing to sacrifice tanks and men at a rate that would have gotten him court-martialed in any Western army. German veterans of the battle had their own perspective. In interviews conducted decades later, they spoke with a kind of traumatized respect about the Soviet offensive. "We had prepared for everything," one former Wehrmacht officer recalled. "We had plans for breakthrough attempts, for infiltration attacks, for airborne assaults. We did not have a plan for what to do when 500 tanks simply refused to stop coming no matter how many we destroyed. It was like trying to stop the tide with sandbags. Eventually, you simply drown." The tank crews who participated in the assault told even more harrowing stories. They described advancing through fields of burning tanks, seeing their comrades die in front of them, knowing that if their tank was hit they had perhaps 10 seconds to escape before the ammunition exploded. They described the order to keep advancing no matter what, to drive past disabled friendly tanks, to ignore infantry calling for support, to think of nothing except moving forward. Many of them understood that they were being used as a battering ram, that their lives were being traded for kilometers of territory. Some resented it. Some accepted it as necessary. All of them were traumatized by it. One TV-34 commander, interviewed in the 1980s, described the moment his tank broke through the German lines. "We had been driving for 3 hours, and we had seen so many tanks burning that we stopped counting. My loader was praying. My gunner was crying. I was just trying to keep the tank moving forward. And then suddenly there were no more explosions. No more anti-tank fire. We looked around and realized we were behind their lines. There were German supply trucks on the road. Soldiers without weapons. An airfield with planes parked in neat rows. And we were the first Soviet tank they had seen. The look on their faces, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe we had broken through. Neither could we. That moment, that instant when Soviet tankers realized they had accomplished the impossible, was replicated hundreds of times across the battlefield. And each time, it reinforced the psychological collapse of the German defense. Because once soldiers believe a position is impregnable, and then watch it be penetrated, they stop believing in the next position too. Konev had not just broken through a defensive line. He had broken through the German belief that they could hold anywhere. What makes this operation particularly relevant to military history is that it revealed a fundamental truth about warfare that remains valid today. Sometimes the most sophisticated defense can be defeated not by a more sophisticated attack, but by a simpler, more brutal attack delivered with overwhelming force and absolute commitment. The Germans had built a defensive system that could defeat any conventional attack. Konev didn't launch a conventional attack. He launched something that looked like military insanity but was actually carefully calculated to exploit the one weakness that sophisticated defensive systems always have: they depend on time to function properly. Take away time, and even the best defense becomes irrelevant. The parallel to Doolittle's decision to unleash American fighters over Germany is striking. Both commanders identified that the enemy's defensive system, no matter how sophisticated, had a critical vulnerability. For the Luftwaffe, it was that they had to come up and fight to protect their industrial targets, which meant American fighters could engage them on favorable terms. For the Wehrmacht's defensive lines, it was that they needed time to identify threats and respond, which meant an attack that moved too fast for them to process would paralyze their command structure. Both commanders were willing to accept casualties that their contemporaries considered reckless. Both were proven right by results that seemed impossible until they happened. In the weeks following the Vistula breakthrough, the Soviet offensive rolled across Poland and into Germany with a speed that shocked both sides. German commanders who had believed they could trade space for time, falling back to successive defensive lines, discovered that there was no time. Soviet tanks were advancing 40 to 50 kilometers per day, not because German soldiers weren't fighting, but because the command structure couldn't coordinate a defense when the situation was changing hourly. By the time a German commander issued orders based on morning reconnaissance, those orders were obsolete by afternoon. Towns that were supposed to be defended for weeks fell in days. Defensive lines that were supposed to hold for months were broken in hours. The Red Army itself was almost as surprised as the Germans. Soviet logistics officers were tearing their hair out trying to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to tank units that were advancing faster than supply trucks could follow. Tank crews were literally running out of fuel and ammunition in German rear areas and having to wait hours for supplies to catch up. In several cases, Soviet tank units captured German fuel depots and used German gasoline to continue their advance, something that would have been considered impossible in earlier years of the war when Soviet and German fuel systems were incompatible, but by 1945 the Soviets had learned to adapt their equipment. The human cost of Kohn's strategy became clear in the casualty reports that filtered back to Moscow. In the first week of the offensive, Soviet tank armies suffered over 40% losses in vehicles and nearly 30% casualties in personnel. These were the kind of numbers that had accompanied disasters in 1941 and 1942. But there was one critical difference. In 1941, these casualties accompanied retreats and encirclements. In 1945, they accompanied an advance of over 200 kilometers and the liberation of half of Poland. Stalin, reading the reports in Moscow, understood immediately what Konev had accomplished. The casualties were heavy, yes, but they were buying something that no amount of careful, methodical warfare could purchase: momentum. And in war, momentum is worth its weight in gold. An army that is advancing rapidly, even at high cost, has high morale and the initiative. An army that is retreating rapidly, even while inflicting casualties, has shattered morale and no initiative. By mid-February 1945, Soviet forces were within 60 kilometers of Berlin. The breakthrough at the Vistula, accomplished in 72 hours in mid-January, had led directly to this strategic position. The war would continue for 3 more months, and the final battle for Berlin would be even more costly than the Vistula breakthrough. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had lost the war not when Berlin fell, but when Kohn's tanks broke through at the Vistula and demonstrated that no German defensive line could hold against the kind of warfare the Soviets were now practicing. The lessons of this operation rippled through military thinking for decades. The 1973 Yom Kippur War saw Israel use similar breakthrough tactics, accepting heavy initial casualties to penetrate Egyptian defensive lines along the Suez Canal. The 1991 Gulf War saw coalition forces use the same principle, concentrating overwhelming force at a single point and driving deep into Iraqi territory before the enemy could respond. Even today, military planners study the Vistula breakthrough as an example of how to defeat sophisticated defensive systems, identify their dependency on time and decision-making, then attack so fast and so hard that you deny them both. But the operation also remains controversial precisely because it was successful. It's easy to condemn reckless tactics when they fail. That's just incompetence. It's much harder to condemn reckless tactics when they succeed, because then you have to grapple with the uncomfortable question: was it actually reckless, or was it a calculated risk that paid off? Konev himself never expressed any regrets about the operation, at least not publicly. In his memoirs, written decades later, he defended the decision in characteristically blunt terms: war is not a chess game where you can take back moves. War is about achieving objectives. The objective was to break through the German defenses before they could be reinforced. We broke through. Yes, we paid a price. But that price was less than what we would have paid fighting through those defenses methodically over months. And the soldiers who died at the Vistula saved the lives of soldiers who would have died in those later battles. It's a cold calculation, and one that makes many people uncomfortable. But it's also the calculation that generals have had to make throughout history. The question is never whether soldiers will die in war. That's inevitable. The question is whether their deaths will accomplish something strategically valuable. By that metric, brutal as it sounds, the Vistula breakthrough was successful. The controversy deepens when you consider the alternative scenarios. What if Konev had followed conventional doctrine? What if he had conducted a methodical, careful offensive, probing for weak points, building up supplies, coordinating with air support. Military analysts who have studied this question generally conclude that such an approach would have taken weeks or months to achieve the same breakthrough, during which time the Germans would have reinforced their positions, potentially bringing in divisions from other fronts. The casualties over that extended period might well have been higher than the sharp, brutal casualties of the actual breakthrough. But they would have been spread out over time, which somehow makes them psychologically easier to accept. This gets at something fundamental about how we think about warfare. We're comfortable with steady, predictable casualties because they feel controllable, rational, the result of careful planning. We're uncomfortable with sharp, concentrated casualties because they feel chaotic, irrational, the result of reckless decisions. But from a purely strategic standpoint, it's not clear that one is better than the other. The Vistula breakthrough also highlighted something that military theorists had long suspected but rarely saw demonstrated so clearly, that in warfare, there is often a non-linear relationship between casualties and results. Doubling your casualties doesn't necessarily double your gains, but under certain circumstances, accepting 50% higher casualties can produce results that are 3 or 4 times greater. Konev had intuited this relationship and bet everything on it. The bet paid off, but it was the kind of bet that could easily have led to disaster if the German defenses had been slightly different, if the weather had been worse, if a dozen small factors had gone differently. This raises the uncomfortable question that military historians still debate: was Konev brilliant, or was he lucky? The answer is probably both. He was brilliant in identifying the specific weakness in the German defensive system and designing an operation to exploit it. He was lucky that battlefield conditions allowed his plan to work. Brilliant commanders understand how to create situations where luck can favor them, but they still need the luck. One German general, captured during the offensive and interviewed later, summed up the German perspective: "We knew the Soviets would attack. We knew they had numerical superiority. We thought we understood their methods. We were wrong. Not because our intelligence was faulty, our intelligence was quite good. We were wrong because we assumed they would be rational, that they would follow military doctrine, that they would be unwilling to accept the casualties necessary to break through our defenses quickly." Konev was rational, just operating on a different calculation of acceptable losses. That was our mistake, assuming that all generals calculate risk the same way. This observation gets at something crucial: military doctrine is essentially a shared understanding of what is reasonable in warfare. It evolves over time based on technological capabilities, casualty tolerance, and past experience. But doctrine can also become a prison, limiting imagination and creating predictable patterns that can be exploited. The most successful military commanders throughout history have often been those willing to violate doctrine when the situation called for it, not recklessly, but thoughtfully, understanding that the rules exist for good reasons but aren't universal laws. Konev violated Soviet doctrine at the Vistula. Doolittle violated American doctrine over Germany. Rommel violated German doctrine in France in 1940. Hannibal violated Carthaginian doctrine at Cannae. The list goes on. What separates these commanders from reckless gamblers is that they violated doctrine only when they had identified a specific reason why doctrine wouldn't work in that particular situation. They weren't rebelling against rules for the sake of rebellion. They were adapting to circumstances that the rulebook hadn't anticipated. The aftermath of the Vistula breakthrough provides a final, sobering lesson about the cost of such operations. In the weeks and months that followed, Soviet hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded tankers. Many had survived their tanks being hit only to suffer horrific burns from the fires that inevitably followed. Others had survived physically intact but were psychologically shattered by the experience of the assault. Soviet records, released decades later, show that rates of combat stress casualties among tankers who participated in the breakthrough were significantly higher than among other units. This isn't surprising. They had been through something that violated every human instinct for self-preservation, ordered to drive forward while watching their comrades burn alive around them. The veterans of this operation carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. In reunions held decades later, survivors spoke about nightmares that never went away, about the sound of burning tanks that they could still hear 40 years later, about the guilt of surviving when so many didn't. These men understood, intellectually, that their sacrifice had been strategically necessary. But understanding something intellectually doesn't make it hurt less emotionally. One tank commander, speaking at a reunion in 1985, 40 years after the battle, said something that perhaps captures the entire moral ambiguity of operations like this. "I have spent 40 years trying to decide whether Marshal Konev was a hero or a butcher. I think perhaps he was both. He sent us into hell, and many of us died there. But the men who would have died if we had failed to break through, they lived. The civilians who would have suffered under German occupation for months longer, they were liberated weeks earlier. How do you balance those lives against ours? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. All I know is that we did what we were ordered to do, and it worked, and I wish to God it hadn't been necessary." That statement, raw and honest, captures something essential about warfare that's easy to forget when discussing grand strategy and tactical innovations. Behind every pin on a map, every arrow showing an advance, every notation of enemy defenses penetrated, there are human beings who paid the price for those achievements. Konev's brilliance was real. The strategic necessity was real. The suffering was also real. All of these things can be true simultaneously. The Vistula breakthrough remains one of the most studied operations in military history precisely because it forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths. It was militarily brilliant and morally troubling. It was strategically necessary and humanly costly. It worked exactly as intended and left deep scars on everyone involved. It saved lives by taking lives. It was rational and insane at the same time. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson is this: warfare sometimes demands that commanders make decisions that are simultaneously right and terrible. Konev made such a decision at the Vistula. The breakthrough succeeded, Germany's eastern defenses collapsed, and the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. But that success came at a price that can be measured in destroyed tanks and casualty figures, but never fully calculated in human terms. The men who paid that price did so believing it was necessary. We honor them best not by pretending their sacrifice wasn't terrible, but by remembering that it was, and by working to build a world where such sacrifices are never necessary again.